and Jews, very similar. You know, people say same corporation, different division. All right? We get along. There's an obvious, thing with the religion. I went to my first Passover dinner. That's what she's like, well, my mother's going to have Pass. Okay, we'll go to the dinner. 7:30, we sit down at her mother's house. I'm starving, right? Starving. They start passing out pamphlets, like reading material. I'm like, what's going on? What are we doing here? What's with the... She's like, no, we read for 2 hours. 2 hours. I said, listen, I'm Italian. As soon as I sit at a table, I got to have bread within 15 seconds of sitting down. All right? I need something to do with my right hand. I need there's some oil coming out. We got oil? I need oil. Now. Hungry. And the food they start bringing out, oh God, terrible, terrible. Jews have no idea what the hell they're doing in the kitchen. These people have no cuisine. Celery, crackers, jam. I'm like, what is it? We're losing. People are leaving. We need food. After breakfast, they fall apart, the Jews. After a bagel, a cream cheese, lox, where are they going? They got nothing. They have nothing. Has anybody ever said to you, we went to this Jewish restaurant last night? The gefilte, amazing. I respect the Jews, but let's just have the Italians cater the Passover meal. All right? Come on. I could read for a couple of hours with some meatballs on the table.
Good morning. It is Saturday, April the 8th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the Star Spangled Banner, we will have No Free Lunch, Mark-Kaye, The Rape of the Mind, George-Lakoff, Donald Trump, commentary, all that and more when I come back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Can you see by the dawn's
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
A people averse to the institution of private property is without the first elements of freedom. Lord Acton. The sine qua non of freedom is private property. A human who cannot freely own, steward, and make decisions around that which he owns will not be able to maintain his for speech, assembly, or worship either. A low regard for private property inevitably means no regard for freedom. And when there is high regard for freedom, there will be high regard for private property.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of mark-kaye.
Donald Trump is innocent. If you listen to his speech yesterday, he said, there's only one crime I've committed.
The only crime that I have committed is to fearlessly defend our nation from those who seek to destroy it.
And Alvin Bragg is among the numbers of those people that are seeking to destroy our nation. Alyssa Farah Griffin had this to say about the indictment.
The court of public opinion matters here, and I think the politics that Donald Trump is going to lean into when we hear him speak tonight, if you're Donald Trump, you're going to say, it's a witch hunt, it's political, it's a partisan DA. So there's some fodder here for Trump to push back. We're going to see this play out, but I'm not sure, in my interpretation as a non-lawyer, this is quite as strong as I expected it to be.
That's because it's not. It's not strong at all. John Bolton said it's not strong. CNN said it's not strong. We've got Alan Dershowitz talking about how it's not strong. And Alan Dershowitz is a big liberal Democrat, has never voted for Trump. And again, is one of those people that is excited to vote against Trump again. Donald Trump is...
And that was mark-kaye with a little bit of talk about Donald Trump's indictment. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, a little bit of Donald Trump ripping Biden's Marxist equity plan.
Joe Biden recently signed a very sinister executive order mandating that almost every federal department and agency establish a Marxist equity, this is something new, enforcement squad to implement a woke takeover of the entire federal government. Every institution in America is under attack from this Marxist concept of equity. Instead of treating everyone equally, making decisions based on merit or qualifications, equity means that benefits are awarded and policies are enforced based on skin color and sexual identity. We don't think that's a good idea. It's a catch-all term used by the radical left to justify every one of its crazy programs. Climate change is now about fighting environmental racism. They falsely accuse law enforcement of racism to explain why they must end cash bail instead of busting up bloodthirsty gangs that kill people all over our cities. With his inaction, Biden is weaponizing every tool of government power to push this racism and this communism and Marxism, or whatever you want to call it. When FEMA, the EPA, and the FAA and IRS are corrupted and tasked with enforcing equity, freedom and equality under the law are absolutely dead. I will revoke this executive order on my first day back in office. I will look forward to it. The Oval Office is a wonderful place, but also a wonderful place to stop things that are very bad for our country from happening. I will instruct the Department of Justice to make clear that any such discrimination is completely and totally illegal, and to investigate the unlawful domination and discrimination and civil rights abuses carried out by the Biden administration. I will immediately terminate all staffers hired to implement this policy and eliminate all offices and initiatives connected to it. We will not allow it to happen. I will create a special team to rapidly review every action taken by federal agencies under Biden's equity agenda that will need to be reversed. We will reverse almost all of them, maybe, in fact, all of them. I will also urge Congress to create a restitution fund for Americans who have been unjustly discriminated against by these equity policies, and I will restore merit-based federal civil service. I will get this extremism out of the White House, out of the military, out of the Justice Department, and out of our government. We don't want it in our country. The United States of America will be strong again. Thank you very much.
And that was former President Donald Trump. I'm having a senior moment here. But anyways, former President Donald Trump saying that what he's going to do in response to President Biden's executive order about equity. And so here's, again, an example of Donald Trump doing something no other politician in this country does. He's making promises. He didn't use the word promise. Instead, he used I will do this, I will do that. He had at least 3 separate promises here. He will reverse the executive order, and then he will fire all the people that have been hired to implement or enforce this executive order. And then the third promise is that he will go to Congress for them to take appropriate action. This is the way politics and politicians should be. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, psychological warfare as a weapon of terror from the book The Rape of the Mind.
Psychological warfare as a weapon of terror. Every human communication can be either a report of straight facts or an attempt to suggest things in situation as they do not exist. Such distortion and perversion of facts strike at the core of human communication. The verbal battle against man's concept of truth and against his mind seems to be ceaseless. For example, if I can instill in eventual future enemies fear and terror and the suggestion of impending defeat, even before they are willing to fight, my battle is already half won. The strategy of man to use a frightening mask and a loud voice to utter lies in order to manipulate friend and foe is as old as mankind. Primitive people used terror-provoking masks, magic fascination, or self-deceit as much as we use loudly spoken words to convince ourselves or others. They use their magic paints and we our ideologies. Truly, we live in an age of ads, propaganda, and publicity. But only under dictatorial and totalitarian regimes have such human habit formations mushroomed into systematic psychological assault on mankind. The weapons the dictator uses against his own people, he may use against the outside world as well. For example, the false confessions that divert the minds of dictators' subjects from their own real problems have still another effect. They are meant, and sometimes they succeed in their aim, to terrorize the world's public. By strengthening the myth of the dictator's omnipotence, such confessions weaken man's will to resist him. If a period of peace can be used to soften up a future enemy, the totalitarian armies may be able in time of war to win a cheap and easy victory. Totalitarian psychological warfare is directed largely toward this end. It is an effort to propagandize and hypnotize the world into submission. As far back as the early 19th century, Napoleon organized his Bureau de l'Opinion Publique in order to influence the thinking of the French people. But it fell to the Germans to develop the manipulation of public opinion into a huge, well-organized machine. Their psychological warfare became aggressive strategy in peacetime, the so-called war between wars. It was a result of the Nazi attack on European morale and the Nazi war of nerves against their neighbors that the other nations of the world began to organize their own psychological forces. But it was only in the second half of the war that they were able to achieve some measure of success. The Germans had a long head start. Hitler's psychological artillery was composed primarily of the weapon of fear. He had, for example, a network of fifth columnists whose main job was to sow rumors and suspicions among citizens of the countries against which he eventually planned to fight. The people were upset not only by the spy system itself, but by the very rumor of spies. These fifth columnists spread slogans of defeat and political confusion. Why should France die for England? Fear began to direct people's actions.
Instead of facing the real threat of German invasion, instead of preparing for it, all of Europe shuddered at spy stories, discussed irrelevant problems, argued endlessly about scapegoats and minorities. Thus, Hitler used the rampant, vague fears to becloud the real issues, and by attacking his enemy's will to fight, weaken them. Not content with this strategic attack on the will to defend one's self, Hitler tried to paralyze Europe with the threat of terror. Not only the threat of bombing, destruction, and occupation, but also the psychological threat implicit in his own boast of ruthlessness. The fear of an implacable foe makes man more willing to submit even before he has begun to fight. Hitler's criminal acts at home, the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the mass murders, the atmosphere of terror throughout Germany, were as useful in the service of his fear-instilling propaganda machinery as they were a part of his delusions. There is another important weapon the totalitarians use in their campaign to frighten the world into submission. This is the weapon of psychological shock. Hitler kept his enemies in a state of constant confusion and diplomatic upheaval. They never knew what this unpredictable madman was going to do next. Hitler was never logical because he knew that was what he was expected to be. Logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more emotional appeal in Cold War than logic and reason. While the enemy is still searching for a reasonable counter-argument to the first lie, the totalitarians can assault him with another. Strategical mental shocks were the instruments the Nazis used when they entered the Rhineland in 1936, and when they concluded their non-aggression pact with Russia in 1939. Stalin used the same strategy at the time of the Korean invasion in 1950, which he directed, as did the Chinese and the North Koreans when they accused the United States of bacteriological warfare. By acting in this apparently irrational way, the totalitarians threw their logic-minded enemies into confusion. The enemy feels compelled to deny the propagandistic lies or to explain things as they really are, and these actions immediately put him in the weaker defensive position. But the galloping lie can never be overtaken, can only be overthrown. The technique of psychological shock has still another effect. It may so confuse the mind of the individual citizen that he ceases to make his own evaluations and begins to lean passively on the opinions of others. Hitler's destruction of Warsaw and Rotterdam after the armistice of 1940, a complete violation of international law, immobilized France and shook the other democratic nations. Being in a paralysis of moral indignation, they became psychologically ill-equipped to deal with the Nazi horrors. Just as the technological advances of the modern world have refined and perfected the weapons of physical warfare, so the advance in man's understanding of the manipulation of public opinion have enabled him to refine and perfect the weapons of psychological warfare.
Thank you. And this was Psychological Warfare as a Weapon of Terror from the Ripe of the Mind by Joost-meerlo, MD. And if you took the word Nazi and substituted the word Democrats, you'd have a perfect analogy for what's going on today in the United States of America. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Part 4, Chapter 10 of Don't Think of an Elephant by George-Lakoff, Ph.D.
Part 4, Framing, Looking Back a Decade. Chapter 10, What's in a Word? Plenty if it's marriage. February 18th, 2004, with some updates in 2014. The original version of this chapter was written over a decade ago before the major advances in the acceptance of gay marriage. The successful strategy used what was recommended in this chapter in the first edition of this book: the stress on love and commitment and the generalization to everyone, not just gays. More than half of Americans now support gay marriage. It is legal in 19 states. But there is still a long way to go in the other 31 states. The conservative framing has not changed. It's against the Bible. It threatens the very definition of marriage. It's a lifestyle choice. Children will be lured into it. It's all about sex. Conservatives these days repeat the word homosexual, which contains the word sex and the slur homo. For example, Texas Governor Rick Perry was reported as saying, "Whether or not you feel compelled to follow a particular lifestyle or not, you have the ability to decide not to do that. I may have the genetic coding that I'm inclined to be an alcoholic, but I have the desire not to do that, and I look at the homosexual issue the same way." For all of that, conservatives are fighting a losing battle against love and commitment, family and community. The younger generation is overwhelmingly accepting. President Obama entered the presidency not being in favor of gay marriage, but being open to evolving on the issue. He has now evolved. The evolution metaphor suggests an adaptation to the changing political context. What's in a word? Plenty if the word is marriage. Marriage is central to our culture. Marriage legally confers many hundreds of benefits, but that is only its material aspect. Marriage is an institution, the public expression of lifelong commitment based on love. It is the culmination of a period of seeking a mate, and for many, the realization of a major goal, often with a build-up of dreams, dates, gossip, anxiety, engagement, a shower, wedding plans, rituals, invitations, a bridal gown, bridesmaids, families coming together, vows, and a honeymoon. Marriage is the beginning of family life, commonly with the expectation of children and grandchildren, family gatherings, in-laws, little league games, graduations, and all the rest. Marriage is also understood in terms of dozens of deep and abiding metaphors. A journey through life together, a partnership, a union, a bond, a single object of complementary parts, a haven, a means for growth, a sacrament, a home. Marriage confers a social status, a married couple with new social roles. And for a great many people, marriage legitimizes sex. In short, marriage is a big deal. In arguing against same-sex marriage, the conservatives are using two powerful ideas, definition and sanctity. We must take them back. We have to fight definition with definition and sanctity with sanctity. As anthropological studies of American marriage have shown, they got the definition wrong. Marriage as an ideal is defined as the realization of love through a lifelong public commitment. Love is sacred in America. So is commitment. There is sanctity in marriage. It is the sanctity of love and commitment. Like most important concepts, marriage also comes with a variety of prototypical cases. The ideal marriage is happy, lasting, prosperous, and with children, a nice home, and friendships with other married couples. The typical marriage has its ups and downs, its joys and difficulties, typical problems with children and in-laws. The nightmare marriage ends in divorce, due perhaps to incompatibility, abuse, or betrayal. It is a rich concept. None of the riches we have just discussed requires marriage to be heterosexual. Not its definition, its sanctity, its rituals, its family life, its hopes and dreams. The locus of the idea that marriage is heterosexual is in a widespread cultural stereotype. In evoking this stereotype, language is important. The radical right used to say gay marriage. Now it's homosexual marriage. One reason I believe is that marriage evokes the idea of sex. And most Americans do not favor sex that isn't heterosexual. The stereotype of marriage is heterosexual. Gay, for the right, connotes a wild, deviant, sexually irresponsible lifestyle. But gay marriage is a double-edged sword. President Bush chose not to use the words gay marriage in a State of the Union address. I suspect that the omission occurred for a good reason. His position was that marriage is defined as being between a man and a woman, and so the term gay marriage should be an oxymoron, as meaningless as gay apple or gay telephone. The more gay marriage is used, the more normal the idea of same-sex marriage becomes, and the clearer it becomes that marriage is not defined to exclude the very possibility. The grammar is important. Gay is grammatically a modifier specifying a kind of marriage. If you understand the expression, then it is not a contradiction in terms and marriage is not defined to exclude gays. Because marriage is central to family life, it has a political dimension. As I discussed earlier and at greater length in my book Moral Politics, conservative and progressive politics are organized around two very different models of married life: a strict father family and a nurturant parent family. The strict father is moral authority and master of the household, dominating the mother and children and imposing needed discipline. Contemporary conservative politics turns these family values into political values: hierarchical authority, individual discipline, military might. Marriage in the strict father family must be heterosexual marriage. The father is manly, strong, decisive, dominating. A role model for sons and for daughters, a model of a man to look up to. The nurturant parent model has two equal partners, whose job is to nurture their children and teach their children to nurture others. Nurturance has two dimensions: empathy and responsibility, for oneself and others. Responsibility requires strength and competence. The strong, nurturing parent is protective and caring, builds trust and connection, promotes family happiness and fulfillment, fairness, freedom, openness, cooperation, and community development. These are the values of strong progressive politics. Though the stereotype is again heterosexual, there is nothing in the nurturant family model to rule out same-sex marriage. In a society divided down the middle by these two family models and their politics, we can see why the issue of same-sex marriage is so volatile. What is at stake is more than the material benefits of marriage and the use of the word. At stake are one's identity and most central values. This is not just about same-sex couples. It is about which values will dominate in our society. When conservatives speak of the defense of marriage, liberals are baffled. After all, no individual's marriage is being threatened. It's just that more marriages are being allowed. But conservatives see the strict father family and with it their political values as under attack. They are right. This is a serious matter for their politics and moral values as a whole. Even civil unions are threatening, since they create families that cannot be traditional strict father families. Progressives are of two minds. Pragmatic liberals see the issue as one of benefits: inheritance, health care, adoption, and so forth. If that's all that is involved, civil unions should be sufficient. And they certainly were in advance. Civil unions provided equal material protection under the law. Why not leave civil unions to the state and marriage to the churches, as in Vermont, the first state of many to adopt civil unions and later same-sex marriages? Idealistic progressives saw beyond the material benefits, important as they are. Most gay activists want full-blown marriage with all its cultural meanings, a public commitment based on love, all the metaphors, all the rituals, joys, heartaches, family experiences, and a sense of normality on par with all other people. The issue is one of personal freedom. The state should not dictate who should marry whom. It is also a matter of fairness and human dignity. Equality under the law includes social and cultural as well as material benefits. The slogan here is freedom to marry. Back in 2004, when the first edition of Don't Think of an Elephant was published, a number of prominent Democrats claimed that marriage was a matter for the church, while the proper role for the state was civil unions and a guarantee of material benefits. This argument has always made little sense to me. The ability of ministers, priests, and rabbis to perform marriage ceremonies is granted by governments, not by religions, and civil marriage is normal and widespread. Besides, it will only satisfy the pragmatic liberals. Idealistic conservatives will see civil unions as tantamount to marriage, and idealistic progressives will see them as falling far short of equal protection. And what of the constitutional amendment to legally define marriage as between a man and a woman? Conservatives will be for it, and many others with a heterosexual stereotype of marriage may support it. But with 19 states legalizing gay marriage and a majority of Americans for it, such an amendment is now dead in the water. Progressives have reclaimed the moral high ground of the grand American tradition of freedom, fairness, human dignity, and full equality under the law. There is no longer a need to talk about civil unions and just the material benefits. The job of ordinary citizens in the remaining 31 states is to reframe the debate in everything we say and write in terms of our moral principles.
This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So I'm reminding you that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.